economic competition, and much more. You're going to meet the top experts in the field. And luckily, as I said earlier, you've already started this conversation. Over the last year, USGLC has held 100 conversations around the country, meeting with members of Congress, where they're talking about why leading globally matters locally. This year, we are on pace to surpass that number. In May last month, we hold on 3 consecutive days, crisscrossing the country, hosting in Seattle, the lead Democrat on the Armed Services Committee. In Oklahoma City, the chair of the most powerful Rules Committee. In Mobile, Alabama, a conservative freshman on the Appropriations Committee. Now, those are 3 very different geographies and 3 very different political ideologies. But there's one common thread. Investing in development and diplomacy matters to our economic and security interests. I don't ever think that these conversations don't matter. I've talked to top congressional leaders, and they're taking notice. Now, here's one thing I'm not going to sugarcoat. I just submitted my testimony to Congress. I have never been as certain that the international affairs budget matters. And I've also never been as certain that there's going to be real hurdles to ensure these resources, which is why this conversation is so important, that we tell the story of what it's worth. Now, here's the great news. Development and diplomacy is working. I just got back from a trip to Africa, where I saw these programs firsthand. I was in Kenya. Now, Chinese investments are everywhere. I saw them because they know that by the year 2050, 1 out of 3 workers on this planet will be living on the continent of Africa. So we need to up our game. There is no question that Kenya, as well as many other countries around the developing world, is open for business. I met with our US ambassador to Kenya, Meg Whitman, who was the CEO of eBay and Hewlett-Packard, a highly effective diplomat. I toured some of these incredible public-private partnerships where USAID and our Development Finance Corporation are investing and making a difference, like a apparel manufacturer where USAID is doing some of the training. These are win-win models of success that are helping the local community and opening up markets for ourselves. I went to Malawi. I saw a Feed the Future nutrition program that is a partnership between the local community, USAID, and Procter & Gamble. It reminded me of that old adage where you can give a community fish and they'll eat for a day, or you can teach them how to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. This was the real deal, providing tools and recipes of how to use the 6 nutritional food groups, teaching technical support of building and planting a garden, and then helping the farmers get their goods to the market so they're more self-sufficient. And the plan is for USAID to be out in 3 to 4 years. So watch my blog. I'll be sharing more stories of what I saw, like the DREAMS program of PEPFAR or an energy program, and they are making a difference. So this is going to be the power of what we're going to talk about at the Global Impact Forum, unpacking the global challenges, hearing stories of impact, being together and engaging as a forum so we're better at telling the story, especially when a number of you go to Capitol Hill. So the last thing, these days, I want to tell you, when I think about what it's worth, there's 3 main reasons for me. Charlie, Winnie, and Maggie. They happen to be my 3 delicious granddaughters, all under, yes, I will clap for them. They're all under the age of 3. The youngest is 3 weeks old. Needless to say, I'm over the moon in love with all of them. But I have to tell you, as I sit with them and play with them, I'm more than ever determined about our journey. Because I know we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to prove their future and all of our children's future to make the world a better place. So, for my little sweeties, all of our children, all of our nieces and nephews and the children of the world, I really want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here, think through these tough global issues that we have, and to make the world a better, safer place. So let's get started. So, my friends, there is no foreign policy issue that dominates the conversations around this town with policymakers from both sides of the aisle than China. There's lots of experts, there's lots of opinions, but there's only one person to begin this conversation with. And that is, of course, USGLC's dear friend, the U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. He is one of the most respected diplomats of our time, having served under 6 presidents, 9 secretaries of state during his distinguished career. There's too many positions in his post of his career for me to name, but I'll tell you this. He has 15 honorary degrees. He has so many awards, but I'll mention 2. The State Department's, the Secretaries of State Distinguished Service Award, and the Presidential Distinguished Award. Today, he leads a team of 47 government agencies at the Embassy of Beijing and 4 consulates, perhaps at the most complex mission on the globe. Now, most importantly for my sons, he happens to be a passionate Red Sox, Celtics, and Patriots fan. Please join me. He's live from Beijing, and welcome Ambassador Nick Burns. There he is. I hope. There he is. Mwah! Welcome, Ambassador. It's so lovely to see you.
It's really great to be here. 12-hour time difference. It's end of a long working day here, but I'd rather be any other place but with all of your friends and this audience, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation with this.
Wonderful. Well, we have lots of questions to ask you, so let me start with this. You know, you have incredible insight into one of the most complex relationships between the U.S. and China. I know you were, I think you first visited there almost 40 years ago with the late Secretary George Shultz, and you've watched this ebb and flow relationship over those many, many decades. You were with President Biden in Bali in November when you visited, they met with Xi Jinping, and kind of hopeful at that time, but since then we've had Balloon Gate and obviously the most recent altercations. I watched as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in the Shangri-La dialogue this weekend, and he expressed his disappointment that his counterpart would not meet with him. But I saw your tweet yesterday where you tweeted out Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, who said, "We're ready to engage China without preconditions, helping to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict." Ambassador Burns, share with us your assessment right now of where we are with U.S.-China relations and where we're heading.
Liz, thank you, and again, it's good to be with you. This is, I think, in my estimation, the most important bilateral relationship, the U.S. and China, that we have now and will have for the next several decades. So for a lot of the young people in your audience today who are your fellows, you'll be dealing with China in multiple dimensions for your entire career. And Liz, I'd break it down to 3 major points. First, we have a very competitive, difficult, often very contentious relationship between the U.S. and China. We're competing on some of the most important issues in the world. We're certainly competing for military power and security in the Indo-Pacific. We have this extraordinary alliance system with Japan, the U.S. alliance system, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Australia, a strategic military partnership with India. And it's our intention to remain the strongest military alliance structure in this part of the world. China's obviously contesting that. Secondly, we're competing on technology. And that's really, I think, in many ways the heart of the competition between us. It's obvious that if you think about the development of artificial intelligence or quantum sciences and quantum mathematics, and also biotechnology, there'll be a commercial competition between our companies and our research universities, but all those technologies are going to be militarized. And we are determined that the United States and our allies are going to be the first movers in this market, and we're going to develop the technologies to keep us safe success here. And finally, on the competition side, obviously we've got very different values as governments and societies. We believe in human rights. We believe in freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. And so we have profound differences with China on Xinjiang, on the treatment of the Uyghur population there, on Tibet, and certainly on the lack of religious freedom in this country, and on Hong Kong. So if you take those issues all together, and this is just a superficial description of the 1,000 different issues that we're dealing with, we're going to have to compete with China for a long time to protect American interests and American values. Now, just 2 more points. At the same time, President Biden has determined with President Xi Jinping that there are some places we can work together. Climate change is one of them. We're the 2 largest carbon emitters. China's number 1, we're number 2, some good distance behind. But John Kerry is working, I think, on a very practical basis with his Chinese colleague Xie Zhenhua. And obviously we have a responsibility to each other and to the world to make progress and to limit the average rise in the global temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade in this decade. That's the goal. And we really want China to begin to arrest its carbon emissions. We think we can work with them. We hope we can in the fight against infectious diseases. If you think about the global health challenges that are ahead of us and ahead of this young generation in your audience today, certainly on the issue of food security and food security in places like the Horn of Africa, and that's been created by climate conditions, but also by Russia's vicious war, an illegal war in Ukraine. And we ought to be working, obviously, on narcotics. And here I just want to pause and say to your audience, Liz, the leading cause of death among young people in the United States is fentanyl.
Yep.
And most of the fentanyl in the United States comes from the drug cartels in Mexico. And the precursor chemicals that make up fentanyl are sold by black market firms here in China to the drug traffickers in Mexico and Central America. So we have been pushing very hard that the government of China use its considerable power to shut down the ability of these black market Chinese firms to sell the fentanyl. And frankly, we have not seen progress on this issue. I've had discussions very recently on this. We're pushing very hard. We've taken some initiatives just in the last 2 weeks to sanction Chinese companies and Chinese individuals engaged in this really nefarious trade. And we're not going to quit in raising this issue and expecting that the government of China will do the right thing. And so there are a whole host of issues where we hope to work together, but it's complicated. We see progress on climate change perhaps, but not progress on fentanyl. And I guess the very last thing I should say, Liz, is obviously, you know, this relationship is an important one for the future because we're the 2 largest economies in the world. We're the 2 strongest militaries. We have the 2 strongest science and technology foundations to our societies. And so while we compete, it's important that we manage that competition so that it has limits and barriers, and it's always a peaceful competition. And that's something that President Biden feels very strongly about, and obviously as his representative here in China, something that I try to do every day as we deal with the government. So forgive the length of this answer, but you know, we could create an entire course at a normal university to answer your very good question.
Well, that was an extraordinary tour de force of all of the issues. I could drill down on each one, and we only have a few minutes of your time. I have to push a little harder on your economic, starting there, but I'm going to try on those. I'm really glad you mentioned fentanyl. I did a op-ed about it a few years ago, and I'm so glad that the U.S. is continuing to push hard on that one. Economics, you just talked about the pull and tug. We've got, I hear the rumor that the Commerce Secretary might be the first cabinet secretary to go to meet you in Beijing. 2 sides of that, as you said. One is they're not playing by the same set of rules of the road, but we've got almost $700 billion of trade. Nick, how do you manage to make sure and push, particularly on tech, that we are making sure America has a fair playing field? Quickly, what are you doing to help American businesses?
We're arguing with the Chinese government, the government here, to meet its commitments under the World Trade Organization, not to allow its companies to rip off the intellectual property of American companies. So trying to hold China to a standard and enlisting other countries in the world, the Japanese, the European Union, the South Koreans, to do the same thing. And I think that is beginning to have an impact on the Chinese here. That's first. Second, we're objecting to some of the practices of the government. Just in the last couple of months, we've seen 5 American companies targeted: Deloitte and Bain and Capvision and Mintz Technology and Micron Corporation. And it's not happening to companies of other countries, but it is to ours. It looks political in nature. It looks like payback from the Chinese perspective, and it's wrong. And obviously, we're going to resist this, and we're going to push back. As we've done in many of these instances. Third, your audience might not have heard of an emerging amendment to the espionage law here, which is going to go into effect on July 1st. And it broadens the definition of espionage to include activities that any business would do: due diligence, collection of data, data sets to look at a joint venture. It also could imperil not just businesses under the espionage law, but academic researchers, students, professors, scientists who use data as a normal course of what they do. And we are pushing back against the government here and advising them, and a lot of other countries are piling on with us to change this law, because it's going to really put a chill into this economic relationship. So I must say,
Right.
I spent a lot of my time here, Liz, obviously raising very difficult issues and doing our best. And I've got a great group of people here, men and women, working with me to resist these worst aspects of the policy of the government of China.
So one question, sticking with economics for a minute, I was telling the group that I just got back from Africa. You go, frankly, anywhere in the global south, and you see the Chinese investments, a soccer field, a road, a building. I just looked at some data. Over the last 10 years, China has increased their development investments by over 430%. Their diplomatic investments, they're saying they're going to increase by $8 billion. Talk to us about what you see as how China is using, the PRC is using their development and diplomacy tools to increase their global influence, and how you see U.S. using our development and diplomacy tools to use our global influence. And I should say that the Senate Appropriations Committee just had a hearing on this very topic, and there's real bipartisan support of us upping our game. What do you see from your perspective?
Well, obviously, you've seen over the last 10 years China's Belt and Road Initiative expand everywhere in the world, not just in Central Asia and in the Southeast Asia where it started, but in Africa, in Latin America. China has become the largest trade partner of over 70 countries in the world. And China is now the biggest lender in the world, and a bigger lender than all the other countries that have normally lent: the United States, Japan, European Union, and our development banks together. So if we're looking at debt as a major problem for countries like Sri Lanka or Zambia and many other countries between, we're looking for the government here to be more responsible and to work with the rest of the world to try to alleviate the debt burden in some of these places. And I think, we're beginning to work, the United States, with the European Union to offer an alternative where our lending would be transparent, we would be accountable, we'd have labor and environmental and human rights standards that ought to be part of any 21st century trade and investment agreement, that it concerns potential debt by a developing country. And that is obviously the way to go. So like everything else in this relationship, it really is a competition of ideas, of ideology, of one country versus another, offering a very different vision for the future. And we would hope that the vision that we are offering with a lot of other democratic countries around the world is going to be much more sustainable and more effective in the long term.
I want to go to security. You talked about one more tension, which is, of course, security, and talk about Taiwan. I visited Taiwan in November of last year. What opportunities, if any, are there to bring the tension down around Taiwan?
Well, we're trying to do that. It's very important that that the government of the People's Republic of China commit to a peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences, and they haven't done that. It's very important that when you have an event like Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last August, or Speaker McCarthy's recent meeting, Kevin McCarthy's recent meeting with Tsai Ing-wen in Los Angeles, that the Chinese understand they can't just fire rockets across the island of Taiwan. They can't cross the median line that has really kept the peace since 1954 in the Taiwan Strait, that that's a critical international waterway, and that the fate of the global economy really rests on peace and the continuation of container traffic and commercial traffic through there, and that any resolution of this long festering problem has to be peaceful. That's the message that we bring to this relationship every day. And it brings up an interesting issue and an important one, Liz, and that is channels of communication between us. We've taken the position that because we have major differences between China and the United States, we've got to have more consistent conversations. And yet you saw just last weekend when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin offered to meet with his Chinese counterpart, Li Shangfu, the new Minister of Defense, the Chinese said no to that meeting. After Speaker Pelosi's visit, the Chinese shut down our three most important military-to-military channels. And these channels are resigned to, in a crisis, to answer your question, reduce the temperature, figure out if there's been an accident, how do we resolve that without having a situation deteriorate so that you end up on the verge of conflict. There's nothing more important than that. Our militaries, our navies and our air forces, China's and America's, are operating in very close proximity to each other in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait. We play by the rules. We make sure that we sail and we fly in international waters and in international airspace, and we abide by all of the necessary laws and regulations pertaining to the law of the sea. We want to see China do the same thing, and we want to see China commit to conversations between us, routine conversations, military to military. And that's also true in the diplomatic space. You know, we hadn't had, after the balloon incident, after our public disagreement with China over Russia's war in Ukraine, we had a period of a couple of months where there wasn't much conversation. Our view is we've got to talk, and we have to talk consistently, and we'll continue to take that position with the PRC.
Can China play a constructive role in Ukraine?
You know, we hope so. It all depends, you know, on what decisions the government here makes. If you notice, when China published its 12-point position paper on Ukraine a month and a half ago, the very first point they made was that they said that they believe in the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any nation. That's what's at stake in Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. It's the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So I met recently with Ambassador Li Hui, who is the Chinese ambassador who went to Moscow and Kyiv and Warsaw and Berlin and Paris on this tour to see if China could contribute to a peaceful resolution. And we hope very much that they'll make the right choice. But the right choice for China is going to push Russia to adhere to international law, withdraw its troops, and see the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine restored. That's what the world wants and expects. And so, you know, I think the jury's out. I can't predict what the government of the People's Republic will do, but that's what we're obviously standing for, and they know our position.
Let me try to get two more questions in. You talked at your opening about it's not just competition, that's the primary mode we're in, but there is an effort to try to have cooperation. You mentioned a few. How effective have you felt you've been, and the other side has been, in terms of the two nations cooperating on these big global issues that we're not going to solve unless Washington and Beijing work together? Climate, you mentioned, health, food security. How are we doing on these dialogues of global challenges?
You know, it doesn't obviously always come down to China and the United States, because you need every country in the world pulling on the same oar, as you know, Liz. But obviously, as the two big global leaders and powerful economies, we have a self-interest, obviously, to work with each other on some of these issues. But we also have an obligation to the rest of the world, because climate change is not going to be addressed effectively unless 195 nation states do it together. Now, China's about 30% of global emissions. We are between 10 and 11%. We're the two largest. I actually think that the relationship that former Secretary John Kerry has built with his Chinese counterpart has been effective. And I think that's going to continue. On global health, let's hope that we can work together to reinforce the World Health Organization, because we've had 4 pandemics in the last 20 years. And the law of averages will be, we'll face another one sometime in the next several years. And we've got to be ready this time. And we hope that countries will be willing to work together in that space. So it's a really good question. And we believe that we ought to test this proposition, that China can rise to the occasion and work with us and work with other countries. But as a lot of things in diplomacy, it takes a while. It takes years to work on some of these problems. So hard to give a grade or a snapshot picture of where we are, but we're certainly pushing and hoping that the Chinese will work with us on some of the issues.
Nick, in our 30 seconds remaining, I know that one of your ambitions is to get out and try to meet with the Chinese people, not just do government to government. Give us a 30-second snapshot of how inspiring that is to do.
Well, it's important. This is a big, complicated country. It's an incredible country in many ways. The Chinese people are energetic, talented. And I've gotten out to the universities, Fudan in Shanghai, Tsinghua here in Beijing, Nanjing as well. And I must tell you, I think part of the hope of this relationship has to be people to people and students working together. Let me leave you with 2 data points. There are 295,000 Chinese students in the United States, and they enrich our country. There are only 350 American students in all of China. So we want to build that people-to-people relationship, because the governments are going to compete, and that's my job. But you also want to have foundation to a relationship for the future where the peoples can understand each other, and we need the doors to be open to American students here. I hope that'll be the case. We need more American tourists here, because as we compete, people need to comprise the long term of this relationship. So I think that's a big challenge for both of our countries, and I am working hard on this one.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Ambassador Nick Burns for all he does to make us safe. Mwah.
Thank you, Liz. Really good to see you. Thanks for the invitation.
Come visit. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michelle Beckering, Director of National Engagement for USGLC.
Thanks. Great. Thank you, Liz. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Beckering, and I'm the Director of National Engagement here at USGLC. This year's theme for our Global Impact Forum really focuses on that nexus between global stability and American stability. And I can't think of a more apt conversation than the one we're about to have around the role of global food insecurity in fostering many of the crises and conflicts we're seeing around the world. And today, we are most fortunate to be joined all the way from Rome by an inspirational leader who is tackling this issue head on. And this is truly someone who doesn't need an introduction, but I'm really delighted to join virtually to the stage here Ambassador Cindy McCain. Ambassador Cindy McCain is the newly appointed Executive Director of the World Food Program. Ambassador McCain previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Agencies for Food and Agriculture and is a longtime friend of USGLC, previously serving as the chair of our USGLC Arizona State Advisory Committee. Ambassador McCain, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, Ambassador, as you well know, today we are facing a global crisis really of unprecedented levels. And we're talking about these linkages between hunger, between food insecurity, mass migration, and conflict. And what we've come to all realize is this humanitarian crisis of hunger, of starvation, it's actually now become a global security crisis. And as the largest vendor to the World Food Program, the United States has really stepped up around the world to address this issue. But we've seen that in recent years, it's really accelerated due to several factors. One being COVID, 2 being conflict, and 3rd, changes in the climate. So So much work remains, but we are so delighted that you are at the helm of the world's largest humanitarian organization that is tasked with feeding the hungry. And so we want to learn a little bit from you, even in the face of these daunting challenges. Now that you are newly in your leadership role, what is your vision for the World Food Program? And, given the reality, how are you going to tackle these challenges?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And more importantly, thank you for talking about this particular subject. It is critical at this particular time. And the magnitude and the scope of this was exactly as you said. It's worldwide now. And it is an issue that we talk about in terms of it being a national security issue. Food security is a national security issue. WFP has two responsibilities in all of this. It's to save lives and it's to change lives. So what does that mean? Emergency food assistance, and we're all aware of what that means and where it takes place in crises, areas of natural disaster, areas of conflict. And it also, the other portion of this is, of course, changing lives, and that is resilience. Making sure that these people no longer need to be dependent on emergency food systems, but more importantly, can then sustain their own lives and grow their own food and improve their own lives. So we serve two worlds in all of this. And right now our priorities are funding, partnerships, and innovation. My vision for all of this is to make sure, with the lack of funds that we have right now, to make sure that we are a leaner, meaner organization. We do more with less, and more importantly, we improve on our innovation, our technology, our science aspects, everything to help other people help themselves, and that's why we're here. As David Beasley used to put it, he wants to put us out of business, and I agree with him. I'd love nothing more.
Well, I think that's such an interesting way to put it, right? Because I'm not sure a lot of people think about, the World Food Program in that light, right? Where it's really this dual-hatted mission, right? To truly provide the food, the hungry need to survive. But to your point, you're really also working on the sustainability, right? And using these fundings and using these programs, to try to get to the root of the causes of this. And I think that innovation is just so timely. As you started to mention, there's a lot of challenges, so I think your own agency recently said that 2023 is expected to be a year of crisis. And 258 million people in 58 countries, right, are really at the point of acute hunger. But that's the facts, right? And we know that and we grapple with that. But what does it really mean? What are the challenges on the ground to actually get food to the hungry? What is it like, procuring the wheat, the supply chains? There's so many issues involved. What are the exact challenges that you're facing right now?
Well, any number of things. You mentioned, first of all, conflict, COVID, climate change. All of those are challenges right now. The numbers that you gave were certainly accurate, but they were last year's numbers. We estimate this year that there will be 345 million people that are severely impacted by food insecurity. It looks as if in Somalia we'll have 4.7 million as opposed to 3 million people. The areas of the world that are most impacted, of course, need the grains that we talk about the absolute most. I was fascinated to hear, I got in on the tail end of the discussion with Ambassador Burns on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The Russians are playing a dangerous game here. We are a non-political organization, so we can only give what we have and do what we can do. But the fact that they're holding grain hostage and they're holding hunger hostage is absolutely unconscionable. And so the fact that he was very right in saying our countries around the world have got to get pulled together on this to try to help, because the impact of that lack of grain is causing countries like the Sahel, areas like Sahel, countries like DRC Congo, Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia. They're basically holding them hostage because we won't have enough grain, nor will we have enough money to supply the grain. And so we're in a very, very desperate situation on the ground. But what we actually do on the ground is we distribute food. We also distribute cash. Now, what does that mean? We don't hand out bundles of cash. It's done through a system that usually goes to cell phones to the women in the community. And the women are then the buyers. They can buy food on the local economy. That's another way that we impact. And then, of course, we help with resilience. All in all, though, what we don't want to do is continue to hand out. We want to start handing up, and that's really what we're trying to do.
I had the just really touching experience a couple weeks ago to go to Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, and I got to meet with many of your fine team there and really look at what that food distribution is like. And I have to say that cash program has been game-changing in the refugee camp because, to your point, it's thoughtfully tailored. And when we met with the refugees, they talked about how it had changed because it gave them this sense of agency, right? It gave them this sense of, to your point, this resiliency to now feel like they were in control of their situation and having that. And it's just remarkable the impact that has had. So I know you've done a lot of work with Congress, and definitely food insecurity is an issue with strong bipartisan support. Recently, you led a bipartisan CODEL. Senators Risch and Graham were among those on it to Zambia. And I'm curious what sort of the impressions were and what you're hearing out of Congress from that. And knowing, as you said, that there are increasingly the linkages made to this issue and national security.
Well, first of all, it was a wonderful trip, and I was very grateful to be a part of it and to be able to take them into the field. It's one thing, as you said, to talk about it on Capitol Hill. It's another thing to see it, to smell it, to feel it on the ground. And that's what I really wanted them to have the experience of. What they were able to see was not just the refugee or IDP situation there, but also see the resilience work that's being done. And so with that, we have a great program right now that the United States government is participating in, and it's called soil mapping. Now, what's that? Soil mapping will enable Zambia to better understand their soil, be better able to regenerate their soil. That means they can plant and feed themselves. That's a huge deal in that part of the world. And the members of Congress saw that firsthand, and they also saw firsthand the importance of the cash-based transfers. And just as you said, the integrity that it gives to people that are able to receive it, and the ability to feel a little bit empowered and also to feel secure. And so those kinds of things are much more powerful than just handing somebody a bag of food. It really is. So, and I look forward to, we've continued our discussions on Capitol Hill. Obviously, I'll be on Capitol Hill to, with my tin cup out, of course, but I look forward. All the members of Congress that I travel with are very knowledgeable on this issue, and they want to maintain what we are doing worldwide. It's important.
Well, on that note, most of us here in the room are actually going to be on Capitol Hill tomorrow. And
Yay.
yes, and so we want to be the message bearers for you. So, give us your sort of elevator pitch. In all of our meetings tomorrow on the Hill, how can we most effectively advocate for the importance of congressional support for food security?
Well, if there's one message in this that I can offer, it's although Ukraine is very important, Ukraine is not the only place that there is food insecurity and hunger. So that's the first message I would take. We can't forget the rest of the world. As I said, there's 345 million people that are hungry here. We have to do a better job in terms of working on the root causes of hunger. And so the resilience portion of what we do is very important. Last year, the United States gave $7 billion to USAID into WFP, and we were so fortunate to receive that. That was over half of what the world gave. So my job now is to not only continue to encourage the United States of America to be bold in what they do here and understand the consequences as could happen if we don't, but also encourage the rest of the world to step up even harder. And so that the message I would take is not only to encourage them, obviously from the U.S. side, but also to remind our friends in the EU and remind our friends, around the world that we need their help also. We cannot do it alone. And bringing our private partnerships into this, private sources for money. Government can't be the only end of this. It can't be. And so I'm making a real push through WFP to work on private partnerships and private funding.
Ambassador, as always, such great advice. Thank you for your leadership on this, and please consider us your advocates. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage USGLC board member Selena Jackson.
Good morning. I'm Selena Jackson of Procter & Gamble, and I'm a proud member of the USGLC Board of Directors. I'm honored to introduce our next conversation, which is driving America's economic competitiveness. We're going to discuss how the United States, together with the private sector and companies like P&G, where we can harness the economic, security, and diplomatic tools to open and stabilize emerging global markets and remain strategically competitive around the world. Joining us for this conversation are four special guests. Alice Albright is the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. She brings to this role 30 years of international experience in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors. She also served as the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education and the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Ex-Im Bank. Dr. Jay Shambaugh is the Undersecretary for International Affairs at the Treasury Department, where he oversees international economic policies regarding the World Bank, IMF, G7, and G20, and also subjects around exchange rates, climate, and financial regulation. He's currently on leave as a professor of economics and international affairs at the George Washington University. He's also a proud Fletcher graduate like myself. Candy Wolf is the Executive Vice President and Head of Global Government Affairs at Citi. Candy served during the administration of George W. Bush as Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs. Candy also serves as the co-chair of USGLC's Board of Directors. Moderating the conversation is someone I met like 35 years ago, is Steve Clements, who joins us from the really new and cool Semaphore, which is today's media partner, and he serves there as the founding editor-at-large. Please join me in welcoming Alice, Jay, Candy, and Steve.
Thank you, Selena, and thanks for aging at least me in this. Hey, it's great to be with all of you, and Semaphore is very, very happy to be today's media sponsor. I've been writing about and engaged with USGLC for what I feel is decades. I think it's one of the most important organizations dealing with a question which we're going to get into right now in American engagement in the world and what the terms of it are. And I really commend all of you for taking this subject so seriously and the role you play in this, or hopefully you play. If you're on the sidelines, get in. But when I start out, and we've got a fantastic panel here, and we're going to have a chat. And then go to a few of you. But when I was looking at this is not a bland topic. This is a topic that is highly important on looking at American engagement in the world. And I want to start with you, Jay, and just say, the global economy is, predicted to go through a real slump here when you kind of look at the global economic data and predictions. And when you compare that to sort of how some of our other peer competitors in the world, China, are positioning themselves in the world, I guess my question is, when I talk to U.S. policymakers, they either come in with a strong degree of confidence about Americans' portfolio and engagement in the world, and there is no wrong. So it's the posture of confidence. And I'm wondering if we ought to have a posture of concern, and whether or not we are not meeting the targets we should, that this should be something our hair is on fire about. Because if you are in a posture of confidence, I'm just wondering, are we doing enough? So I'd be interested, as you share your perspective on how the global economic climate is affecting American engagement, are you concerned or are you confident?
So I'm an economist by training, so I'm always concerned. That's just my standard posture. That being said, when I think about the global economy, and in particular the U.S. role in the global economy, I think I do come from a position of confidence. I think when I look, I think as Secretary Yellen said in her speech about the U.S.-China relationship, the demise of the U.S. economy has been predicted many, many, many times, and there have been various countries that were going to overtake us and make us irrelevant, and all of those predictions have been wrong, and I don't think there's any clear reason why you'd think otherwise right now. Frankly, when you just look at what the U.S. strengths are long-term, again, medium and long-term. If we're talking about business cycle fluctuations and what's going to happen in one country versus another, that's a forecasting game that I don't know that we need to get into here. But I think the gist of your question of should we have confidence as U.S. policymakers about the U.S. role in the global economy, I think there the answer is yes, just we have the strongest education system and innovation system, and I think those are the things that are the best structure in terms of rule of law and things like that, and really strong alliances around the world.
So let me just interrupt you there, but put yourselves in a African leader's shoes for a moment. Not the United States projecting how great we are, but you're looking at that African leader weighing options. Do they go and get in a debt trap with China? Do they hang out and wait for America to pay them attention? As you're looking at the developing world, which so much of this conference is about, are we affecting the calculations of those leaders in Africa or the global South that what you just said matters and touches them?
Yeah, I think it's on two fronts. I think on the one hand, I'd say if you ask yourself, where would you rather do business? I think unquestionably the answer is with us, right? I think they want to trade with us. They want to sell us goods. They want foreign investment from the United States. They know foreign investment from the United States or from the international financial institutions comes in a high standards way that is built to be a partner to them, not an exploitive relationship. I think they understand that. We took a 10-day sweep through Africa with the secretary early at the start of this year, and that was very clear from our conversations that we were there as a partner, we wanted to be there as a partner, and they understood that. I think on the flip side of your question, does China play a big role in parts of Africa? It does, and I think that sometimes suggests, there hasn't been enough funding coming, whether it's from the international financial institutions or from foreign direct investment, and it's left countries sometimes looking for other options. But I think if you ask them which they prefer, if both were on the table, I think our deal is a better deal. And I'd honestly say, I think when you say have we left it open, I think you look at what MCC does. They're all over Africa. If you look at Power Africa, it's all over Africa. If you look at PEPFAR, I mean, we're there as a partner and doing a lot of important work.
Alice, I'd love to talk about what MCC is doing to be there. Millennium Challenge Corporation, of course, is part of America's toolkit in addressing global development down there. A few years back, I moderated a dinner with Bono, and he said, we're doing a lot behind the scenes, but nobody sees Made in America on it. They do see a lot of Made in China products. And while we're not talking about products, we're talking about systems and private-public partnerships and the tools you have. I'd love to get a sense of whether you're concerned or confident, given your toolkit, that we have enough to make an impact on the development vector of the Global South.
Well, thank you, and let me thank USGLC for hosting this. What a great event. I always love coming to USGLC events. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from the Undersecretary. When I look at the conditions in many of the countries that we work in, I am concerned. I think that a lot of COVID, climate, economic shifts, inflation, the list goes on, has had a very devastating impact on many of the partners that we have. Now, the good news is that MCC is a very strong tool. I do think we can do more of MCC. Just for those who don't know us, we've been in business for 20 years. We are a grant maker. That stands in stark contrast to what China is doing, which is often acting as a lender. We provide grant financing in the hundreds of millions of dollars to critical sectors that are the biggest challenges that a country has. We work very closely with countries on making sure that where we're deploying our grant dollars is where they think their strategic challenges are. So we've got a great tool, but we can do more. And we've got a lot of work ahead of us in terms of making sure that we're addressing where the real challenges are. One thing that's very much on our mind in the Do More department is legislation that is up in front of the Hill. And I know that you all are heading up to the Hill shortly. And I would welcome you to advocate for this. We have a piece of legislation on the Hill. I want to thank all the congressmen and senators that are already very much in support of it. Chairman Risch, for example, Chairman Menendez, folks in the House. What this piece of legislation does is it essentially expands our geographic footprint from currently the 81 lowest income countries in the world to 115. And there's two pieces to take away from that. One is that it will enable us to continue to work in all of our partner countries where they are eligible to try to alleviate poverty and boost economic growth. And that's really what our mission is. But there's also good news for us here at home. By developing these long-term, trusted, open, transparent relationships, it creates stability for us as a foreign policy matter. It creates opportunity for businesses here in the States to get involved. You talked about Made in America. We do work with businesses to try to figure out where our grant funding coincides with what people are interested in. So it's a terrific tool. There's more that needs to be done, and I think we have to be very much aware of what is ahead of us, because there's an uphill climb in helping a lot of our partners alleviate poverty.
So if you get 82 countries expanding to 115, do you get a 50% jump in your budget and assets?
I'm going to say I hope so, but we will work within the footprint that we have.
Do you have enough assets with a footprint that large in these developing countries to do the job you need, or do you need a bigger pot?
Well, we can always do more with more. What we have done since we were created in 2004, I think speaks volumes about what we can do with the funding that we've had. We've deployed over $15 billion in 46 countries, in 74 different compacts and thresholds, which are the names of our programs, and we've helped 270 million people recover from some form of poverty.
Right.
So we are what I would call a highly efficient mechanism. Our administrative budget is in the neighborhood of $115, $130 million a year. And when you think about what we're able to do with that funding year on year, with our grant funding, it's a substantial track record. So we can do more with more, and I think that it will help us build the types of relationships that you've talked about, Jay, abroad, but it also helps create opportunities for us here at home.
Thank you. Look, I'm probably going to get in trouble with this comment, Candy and my friends in the panel. I think there's a selflessness in a lot of what we're discussing today. I'd like to talk about the national selfishness and self-interest in global engagement. And one of the things that has boggled my mind is watching the Belt and Road Initiative around the world grow, take hold, see the financial relationships, look at the investment, as America seemed to do very little in response. And now we have the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment Policy, or investment, Candy, and a $600 billion commitment to basically try and catch up. And I'm wondering if I'm framing it the right way, because when I look at that, if it were to succeed and we were to basically bring in new, significant, large-scale investment that tie nations and their interests together with the U.S. and its key allies in the developed world, then I look at that as power. I look at that as America having a beneficial impact on where the globe is going and changing. What I always say, we're changing the weather for the good. But I worry if we're too passive, we don't do it. So that's the self-interest part of this. And I'm just wondering if you could walk us through your role and Citi's role, and as you kind of look at the private-public world behind this new G7 initiative, whether it's real.
Well, maybe step back for a minute and go back to what the Undersecretary was saying earlier. Look, American investment is still well, America is a place where people want to invest. But what we got to show the strength is America's willingness to invest in the world. And the challenge is you've got one set of tools that the US government has available to it, but it's limited. It's not Belt and Road. It's not sort of, we can argue whether China has unlimited dollars these days, but you know, it seems like there's more unlimited dollars you can put in public investment. It's really hard in a democracy to decide where the funding is going to go. So what do you have to do? You have to leverage. And that means there's sort of two different efforts. One is the efforts that the G7 has had, because you got to pull allies together, right? If you pool the money, you've got more resources. The numbers look bigger and you can allocate it more effectively, but then you've got to catalyze the private sector. There's a lot more dollars in the private sector than there is in the private sector, excuse me, than in the public sector. But in order to leverage that money, there's different, you know, there's things that have to get done. And my CEO, city CEO, Jane Fraser, was at the G7. We were asked to speak about, you know, private sector leveraging. And I think there's some practical things that have to get done. Right, and so we can talk about how it's great that we're going to catalyze the private sector, but I think we've got to turn it into reality. And reality means a couple of things. One, there's a lot of reforms that the administration has undertaken with Secretary Yellen around changing the multi-development banks and the structure, right? You can't take the same institutions that have been doing financing the same way for decades and try to apply it to the problems that exist today. And you've got to be able to make changes to those organizations. So I think one is to try to get that development reform and reforms through. But those reforms are long-term, okay? They're not short-term. They're going to take time. So you need some short-term fixes. There's some things that the private sector, we're really good at capital markets. Okay, that's what we do. Banks manage capital markets. Development banks don't manage capital markets. They get lending. And so we need to have a dialogue. There's some things as simple as bringing the technocrats in and understanding what are the constraints that exist in certain development banks today and how they can finance and how you can catalyze the private sector through things like capital markets. And you know, to be honest, there's never been a roundtable conversation where people are sitting down and you bring different banks and different private sectors, whether it's Japan or whether it's, you know, the EU or elsewhere, and you just come in and you say, let's talk about how we solve some of this. And I think the only other point is there's data, there's information, right? Private sector is going to invest if it's worth investing in it. Okay, it's got to be, it's good, but you also have to make it investable. And meaning investable means you got to understand what are the risks and what's the data that you have. And there's data that's available in the federal government that we also think should be made available to the private sector.
So maybe this is a naive question, and I apologize for my ignorance in advance, but it seems to me that the part of the world that Alice is talking about is a part of the world where capital markets may be a distant dream, you know, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I spent a lot of time, I hosted a lunch 2 weeks before Ajay Banga was announced as our nominee for the World Bank. So the lunch had everything to do with it, I'm sure. But Ajay was here basically to talk about the Partnership for Central America. And he was meeting Vice President Kamala Harris and others after this. And if anybody is involved, and I get the numbers right, I apologize, I think they've raised about $4.5 billion of private sector money to come down into the Central American area to try to root jobs, you know, and create sticky economies that basically are more responsive to the population in need, and really deal with some of our southern border problems by stabilizing economies and investing in them. And he told me what a big lift it was. And we organized a luncheon, Semaphore did, where I brought in people from other war-stressed and conflict-stressed regions around the world to see if there was any opportunity in the models. And so when you kind of talk to these folks, maybe capital markets is the answer, but I'm just wondering in these parts of the world where there's so much stress, de-investment, lack of investment, how do we deal with that? Because that's really what I think USGLC is. How does America have an impact? Maybe capital markets is the answer for that, but I'm just wondering, are there other steps?
An answer.
I'm saying?
Maybe Jay's going to comment, because
no,
I think there's,
sure.
you know.
I mean, I do think the MDB Evolution Project is part of this, right? And I think trying to take really seriously what we mean by private sector capital mobilization. And, you know, I don't think it's an accident that Ajay Banga was nominated, right? I mean, he was chosen for a reason. I think he's, if you can very credibly say he is someone who can think about how to bring the private sector together with what the MDBs are doing. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it's also, and it really goes back to almost to your first question as well, Steve, about, concern versus confidence. I think confidence doesn't mean you're done, right? It says, let's go and be really aggressive here. And part of that is leading with PGII. Part of it is trying to pull the private sector in. Part of it is trying to make sure you're using your tools as effectively as possible and merging those things. And so, the MDB Evolution Project, some of it I agree is longer term, but some can hit really quickly. So, we tried very hard to make sure we were able to harvest as quickly as possible low-hanging fruit. And so, in April, 6 months after the Secretary first gave her speech, we had reforms passed that will open up an extra $50 billion over 10 years in headroom at the World Bank.
Right.
That's real money. That's almost as big as the last time they did a capital increase. Like, this is real money on the table, but also changes around incentives, changes around operations to make sure they can work with the private sector better, to make sure they can pull in other capital better, to make sure that they're not duplicating but actually doubling up the efforts that are going on. And so I really think there's lots more room to use the banks, there's room to use PGII. The one thing I would say, though, when you say about the capital markets being absent in some of these countries, when we were in Zambia in January, this is an incredibly poor country going through a terrible debt distress situation, stuck under, realistically, owing money to China and China not being willing yet to come to the table firmly enough to deal with that debt distress. But we were meeting with entrepreneurs. They're still trying to raise capital. They're still trying to start businesses. We met a lot of great business owners there. So I don't think even in the poorest countries you find an absence of a desire for borrowing and investment. It's a question of how stood up are the markets, how hard is it to bring in the private sector, and can you do enough to deal with things like debt distress to make sure the private sector can really leap forward.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. So Alice, I think one of the things that helps a group like this as they're up talking to legislators about why expansion of your program is important is to have human stories of the differences you've made. Do you have a kind of favorite story about the impact of MCC and its toolkit on the development vector of things? Is there something you can share with us? Which child is your favorite of your various initiatives?
I don't know where to start. How much time do we have? Let me come back just a little bit to the question we were just talking about, which is that the whole subject of bringing private capital in, capital markets, international capital markets, local capital markets, development banks, U.S. agencies, it's a very nuanced picture.
Sure.
And we probably should have another conversation about how you actually bring all of that together, because there's a lot of there. On the stories, let me tell you about where I went my last trip, which was to Morocco. MCC has invested over $1 billion in Morocco in 2 compacts going back about 15 years. I was just there viewing a lot of the projects that we've done. Our work there includes everything from land reform, where we've helped the government give land titles for the first time to men and women farmers, which then enable them to take those titles and actually borrow to develop their businesses. I had lunch next to a wonderful woman who's now going to be able to send her kids to school.
So they were not previously titled, or they were owned by the king?
It was a more complicated process that did not allow individual land titles.
Interesting.
And that's a common theme in the countries we work in, is the absence of land titling. So it's a problem. We also see it in Zambia, and where you all just were. We see it in Lesotho. We also saw that country develop some significant industrial zones, which will help attract businesses of all different kinds to set up shop in Morocco. There was all kinds of work done on agriculture. I mean, there's a range of things. Another terrific example is also in Lusaka as well, which is I met with a woman who now has water to her house because of work that MCC has done. And when she met with me, she came out of her house and she said, water is life, and you've changed my life. So we can look, we've got stories that are sort of from individuals that we've worked with. We've also we've transformed sectors. In many of the sectors we do energy work, we have multiplied the energy capacity in that country. We have built hundreds of kilometers of roads. We've completely transformed port capacity. I'm going to Benin in a couple of weeks. We've completely transformed the port and energy capacity in that country. We just signed a $500 million arrangement, our first one that's regional between Benin and Niger. It's going to build a trade corridor from Cotonou, which is the port in Benin, up to Niamey, which is the capital of Niger, which is landlocked, to completely transform how goods flow. We're working on a significant investment in Sierra Leone, which will, by multiples, improve the whole electricity grid in that country. So these are not only sectoral examples, but they're going to impact the lives of people. I've met with people in Sierra Leone who can't start businesses because the energy system is intermittent. So we can make, where we really concentrate on the key sectors, we bring in the private sector, we figure out what the big challenge is, we can make a huge difference. And we've talked a number of times on the panel about China. Let me make one really important point.
Right.
Our money is grant money. It does not have to be repaid. It does not carry an interest rate. It does not have a cash collateral account with it. It is grant money, and it is structured to address the problems that the countries think are the biggest problems.
And real quick, and I'm going to jump to Candy. If I'm Senator Jim Risch and you're telling me that, or someone in the audience is talking to me, and I ask you, what does that do for the American brand? Or, is there a sense that America helped make this happen? Does the public know? What's your answer?
Absolutely, they know. The countries that we work in know exactly that it's the United States that have helped them through MCC, and we see that every time we get on the ground. From a foreign policy perspective, it helps us build stability, trusted relationships, transparency in our engagement with countries. We also work on all manner of areas of reform that helps improve the enabling environment for U.S. businesses to come in. So there are benefits for us. Whoops, that was bad on my microphone. There are benefits for us as the United States in terms of our foreign policy goals, and there are benefits for our partners.
Thank you. And Candy, we're going to go to the audience in just a second, but I want to ask you about something. I guess one of my things I often get in trouble with, I'm not a big fan of sanctions. I'm not a big fan of unilateral sanctions in particular, but I find sanctions often ineffective. They're emotional, but not necessarily effective. I get why we have them, but when you throw a pandemic onto it, you throw sanctions policy onto it, you then throw a lot of money into the economy, you get a lot of inflation, you have a lot of things that happen. And one of the things that came undone, was supply chain, drove up costs. You had a lot of things break down. And I've been asking myself, whether it's sanctions, which also affects, supply chain, during crisis and creates squeezes on, everything you need. I'm just wondering, in terms of you have a macro result of a lot of micro actions. Do you have any insights from your perspective of thinking about financing, global infrastructure, and some of these issues, how we can right that ship, or at least, get the system back into a healthy way? Because we now have what I would call a very wobbly globalization. Globalization used to mean high trust networks. You trusted the movement of ideas, institution, people, money. Now we have connectivity but high fear and uncertainty. And I'm just wondering how you're going to fix that.
Well, that's an easy
In
question,
about 2
and
minutes.
it should be turned over to some of the other panelists. But now, look, I think as being one of the most global banks, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the frictions are in that global economy, and whether it's COVID or geopolitics that have created a lot of that friction. It's there, right? Whether governments are very nationalistic, populistic. We're all doing industrial policy these days, and so I think we're living in the moment of what is the new globalization. Right? And it hasn't sorted itself out yet. In the world of disruption, it's still being disrupted. And so is there a fix? I think it's sort of where it's going to settle. It's hard to know because if you look at corporations, banks, we like certainty. We want as much certainty as possible. If we understand what the rules are, we can figure it out. But when you don't know what the rules are, it's a lot harder. The China tensions make it really difficult,
right?
Particularly, and I think friction. What I worry about from an America greatness is, and maybe it's just the capitalist in me, but it's very much this notion that if we're restricting the flow of capital in many different ways, then are we getting to a point where we restrict innovation in the US?
Right.
And what makes us great is our innovation. It's the ability of that capital to flow to where it needs to flow and to have the creative ideas. And I see it at the states that are restricting the flow of capital in the US, right? There's some states you can do business, there's red states, there's becoming blue states. The politics are sort of taking over on a lot of these topics, and I think, I worry that if we're going to be strong and whether we're going to compete with China on chips and the rest, we should just be in with, making sure that our innovation and that our markets are strong and that our economy is strong, because that's what's going to keep America great.
Real quickly, and then I'm going to go to the audience for sure. Are you, I can't think of any industry that lives under, rule of law globally and the importance of rulemaking than your industry. Is America agenda setting in rule of law in capital and finance secure, or is that being challenged?
No, I think from a regulatory, since the financial crises, really,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the actions of FSB and the G20 and the US, I think, we know what the regulatory regime is to a certain
Right.
point. I think the fear is we're going to get more capital
I see.
requirements, and if you're going to get more capital requirements because
But
you're
I'm also
worried about
wondering,
us,
are we
but
being
that's a
challenged
different
globally?
issue.
Is China challenging us?
Well, I mean, it goes back to the question of the primacy of the dollar, right?
Right.
And are we worried that it's going to be undercut?
Jay, do you worry about the dollar?
Let him worry. I don't worry
believe
about
I'm
it.
paid to worry about the dollar,
Yeah.
but I think
You are
your
paid
broader-
to worry about the dollar?
It's part of my
That's a
portfolio,
great-
but only the Treasury Secretary talks about it. But I worry about it. But I think I would just agree that I think, look, at the end of the day, the U.S. is an open financial system. China is not. I don't see that as like a near-term risk. I would agree that the ability to work with allies, whether it's the G20, FSB, things like that, that's where the real standard setting is taking place, and I think that's appropriate.
Great. I want this to keep going because we're getting.
Can I say two
yeah,
seconds?
Yeah,
just
two
on
sentences,
sanctions?
and then we're going to go to a
I would
question
just
we have
note, when you're talking about sanctions and supply chains, I just think it's always important to note there. First of all, while I agree that unilateral sanctions can be problematic, that the most recent round of sanctions, especially around Russia's war in Ukraine, were very multilateral, and were deliberately crafted to avoid any implications for food or medical care or things like that. And most of all,
Are you surprised how resilient Russia has been?
Well, just one quick thing there. Any disruptions that took place are not because of the sanctions. They're because an autocratic government invaded a sovereign state.
No, I get that.
Right,
yeah.
and I think that's just an important starting point for us always to have on the table.
I agree with that. And the second thing, what I worry about is I have contacts in Russia, just how resilient the place is. I worry about Turkey and India, UAE, Brazil, backstop. So I worry a little bit about emotion and lack of efficaciousness, but that could be another panel down the road. Do you have a question for us? Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Chris McClain. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. My question is around public-private partnerships. And you guys touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's clear that in global development, no one institution or country is going to be able to solve all of these challenges alone. But
Right.
so when it comes to tackling, climate, poverty, competitiveness, all the way around in places like the global South and what have you,
Right.
when it comes to marshaling the private sector, what is the economic case? How do you pitch the C-suite and boardrooms, to be able to put skin in the game on this?
Great, thank you. I'm going to start with Alice real quick, and you do real quick interventions here, and we'll probably have to wrap it up. But marshaling the private sector.
So I think if you're trying to make a case to your C-suite about it, I would look at the demographics, and let me talk about the continent of Africa. If you look at the growth rates and the percentage of those countries that are young, they're going to be a larger and larger percentage of the population by the end of this century. And many of the policy regimes in those countries are trying to build a middle class, and they're trying to acquire goods and services. And they want digitization, they want energy, they want education. The list goes on and on. So if you take a long view, the opportunity is huge. Now the question is how do we get there? And I think that we can all do a better and better job at working with the tools within the US government to figure out how to de-risk individual opportunities that are ahead of us more near term to build that flow of private capital in I could go on, to be continued.
Right. We have about 15 seconds, Jay.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo that point, demographics. If I'm pitching a C-suite, if you're not in Africa and parts of South Asia, you don't want to be in business in 2050. Right, so I think it's pretty clear where growth is, and that was our message when we were in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
We're there because we see you as the future.
Right.
The next 50 years of the global economy, the history will be written in sub-Saharan Africa, and so you should be there if you want to be in business.
And Candy, you are the private sector, so how do you marshal more of yourself?
Well, to the point, I was going to say it's the demographics. We know we've been 50 years in Africa and 40 countries, and so. But de-risking,
Right.
having clarity, dealing with the rule of law, these countries need to develop their systems, and they need, expertise and guidance, and from people in the room that are going to help to get them to a point where it makes it more investable.
Well, please give a round of applause to Candy Wolf of Citi, Alice Albright of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Jay Shambaugh, who's worrying about the dollar at the Department of the Treasury. Thank you all.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome USGLC board member Evelyn Farkas.
Hello, everyone. That's really peppy music they have for us here. Hopefully you're all awake. I'm Evelyn Farkas. I'm the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. I am also a proud member of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition Board. And I'm happy, really, and honored to be able to introduce and to interview our next speaker. We heard, of course, from Beijing earlier today. We heard from Ambassador Burns. We heard about America's China strategy, what we need to do in terms of diplomacy and development. And today, right now, Congressman Mike Gallagher is going to join us to talk about the comprehensive strategy vis-a-vis China from the perspective of Congress. Congressman Gallagher, he serves as the inaugural chair of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, the so-called China Committee. He has served in Congress since 2019, representing his district in Wisconsin. USGLC was fortunate actually to host Chairman Gallagher in his home district in 2018 on the importance of America's global leadership. And so we're obviously very glad to be able to reunite with him today. Just a few other comments about his background. He is, as you know, probably passionate about the issues pertaining to China and to our national security. He is a Marine Corps veteran. He served for 7 years on active duty, including 2 tours in Iraq. And he was also the lead Republican staffer for the Middle East and Counterterrorism Committee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he comes with a lot of experience, a lot of passion, and we look forward to hearing from him today. Welcome, Congressman Gallagher. In January, you were appointed as the first chair of this select committee. You really have been in the spotlight since then. You are the lead voice, Republican, but also, frankly, for the bipartisan committee because you are working so closely with your counterpart. And so we really want to hear from you with regard to what your vision is for America. How should we be competing with China? And what should the comprehensive approach be? So obviously, one component of it is deterrence, which you know very well. How does democracy and development fit into it? So Congressman, if you could just take that first question, that would be great. Okay, I think we need to pause you for 1 second. It's coming through garbled. But I know you wanted to thank USGLC, thank Liz Schreier.
Is that any better?
Let's see, does that work?
Any better right there?
Yes, perfect. Okay, over to you, Congressman.
Insert joke about the Chinese hacking my system here.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I've really been proud to have such a long relationship with USGLC that goes back to when I was a staffer working for Les Munson on the Senate side of Capitol Hill, back when I had real power. And just quickly, I mean, maybe say a couple practical words about what the Speaker asked me to do with this committee. One was to make it a bipartisan effort. He wants Congress, to the extent possible, to speak with a unified voice on this issue. We don't have to grant everything, but wants us to identify the center of gravity and also explain to our colleagues and by extension the American people why any of this matters. I sort of think about it in the same way I think about the conversation we had in my district with USGLC about why American leadership matters. We can't just take for granted that our fellow Americans get the stakes here, particularly when the threat, I think, is a bit more pernicious and insidious than, let's say, the Soviet threat in the early parts of the old Cold War. We've had a variety of Sputnik moments, but we've not seemed to wake up. So our sort of core tasks are twofold. One is to constantly explain why people should care about this competition with the Chinese Communist Party and why we should desire to win this competition. And two, act as the speaker's kind of accelerator and incubator on key, smart, strong China-related legislation in Congress, which is important to have a committee doing that because China transcends every committee jurisdiction. So I have the fun task of kind of coordinating among all the different committee chairs and making sure everyone feels the love and trying to make sure that we actually get stuff done in divided government. So with that practical foundation, how do I view the sort of overall grand strategy? Well, I've always thought of it as having three buckets or three lines of effort. The first, as you alluded to, is the sort of military competition, hard power, the most acute expression of which is how do we deter a conflict over Taiwan within the next 5 years? The second line of effort is what I would call economic statecraft. How do we figure out this complex question of de-risking or selective economic decoupling? What are the right mix of sticks and carrots that we need to reclaim our economic independence in some areas? I was listening to the end of the last panel, ensuring U.S. dollar supremacy lasts and expanding it is obviously part of that equation. And then the third line of effort is what I call ideological competition. How do we make our domestic institutions as well as of our multilateral institutions more resilient against the efforts by the Chinese Communist Party via united front work to weaken them and to diminish us in the ideological domain? And so the Select Committee is marching out on those three lines of effort. We have policy recommendations that are due by the end of this year. We just released our first two reports. The first was focused on defense, on near-term deterrence for Taiwan. We started with that because there's a National Defense Authorization Act markup coming up, and we wanted to take our recommendations and then put them actually into the NDAA. And then we had a second report based on a hearing we held on the ongoing genocide in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region that kind of transcends bucket 2 and bucket 3. And I'm happy to talk more about any of these efforts, but I figure before I get accused of filibustering like a senator, I will stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I think we'd love to drill down on all of those things, but let's drill down a little bit on what China has done in the development arena with the Belt and Road Initiative, specifically in Africa and Latin America. Really, almost, I wouldn't say behind our backs, but we weren't paying close attention. And it's clearly a challenge, and we need to do something with our own diplomacy, with our own development. Can you talk about what your perspective is on that?
Well, a couple of observations. One, there are certain areas where, like, we're not even competing, because competing implies that it's sort of two sides that show up and are engaged in some sort of like match, right? But we haven't even shown up in some areas. A variety of islands in the Indo-Pacific. The fact that we don't have an agreement already done and negotiated with the compact states, I think, is a huge own goal. The complete absence of sort of a proactive, positive trade agenda in the region. There's all sorts of niche multilateral fora that we just, for whatever reason, tend to neglect. The World Intellectual Property Organization got a lot of attention a few years ago due to some Chinese activity. So I guess the first and most obvious point, particularly obvious to this audience to make, is that if you want to win the competition, you actually have to show up. And in a lot of these areas, for a very modest investment of U.S. resources, we can have an outsized impact. And I also think it's an opportunity for Congress to do sort of its own diplomacy in a way that's effective. I mean, members of Congress tend to go on CODELs to kind of all the sexy places, Israel, Taiwan, places like that. But, going to a lot of the Pacific Islands, going to places that don't get a lot of attention, I think can have an outsized impact. The second point I would make is that, as a great Wisconsinite, George Kennan, once said, you have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy to have a nice, quiet little armed force in the background. And so I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that our diplomatic efforts are connected to a robust military deterrent. The administration is trying to make this concept of integrated deterrence work. I've been somewhat critical of it, but I take the point that you can't think of this. You can't have the three lines of effort that I laid out at the beginning completely unconnected. And one of the things we're trying to do on the committee is actually have a hearing similar to what they just did in the Senate Appropriations Committee, where we have representatives from state, Treasury, Commerce, and DOD, which really testify together to really push the administration productively on whether or not our development efforts or diplomatic efforts are connected to our military efforts. One note of caution, however, as we consider this question of working with our allies, of opening lines of communication, I do think that the Biden administration right now is trying to resurrect economic engagement and diplomatic détente with the Chinese Communist Party as a core pillar of our grand strategy. I'm skeptical that this will work for the same reason that it didn't work for the last 2 decades. I just don't think the CCP is interested in cooperation or engagement. They want to expand their power and ideology at our expense. So I think we have to be clear-eyed about that. But there, again, I think we have an opportunity to engage with allies and partners in terms of a global counter Belt and Road initiative, which leads back to my first point. It means, you got to show up. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I don't know if any of that makes sense.
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I actually would love to just drill down a little bit more and ask you to draw on some of your personal experience working in other parts of the world in the military. Where have you seen development actually be a real force enabler or force multiplier for the overall strategy of the United States? And how could we apply that in the China context?
Well, I really saw it in Western Iraq, which was my most formative experience. I did 2 sort of back-to-back deployments there in 2007 and in 2008, and I saw the whole thing transform before my eyes. I mean, going from, I think on the second day of my first deployment, we had a cross-border raid from Al-Qaeda in Iraq that killed 50 people in the local village, to by the end of my second deployment, we could walk around the streets without our helmets on, without our body armor, and it was incredibly non-kinetic and safe. And we were doing a lot of work that could be considered more development work than pure counterterrorism or counterinsurgency work. Or we, in some ways, transitioned from the main effort to a supporting effort for those development efforts. And so, for example, I ran an interrogation team on one of my deployments, and we went from sort of interrogating high value terrorists to sort of interrogating, oil smugglers and people that were screwing up the local economy. So it showed to me at the time, as kind of a naive 22, 23-year-old second lieutenant, just how interlinked these things are and how you can't sort of separate one from the other. And how it was our ability to show ourselves as the strong horse to provide basic security then opened up the opportunity for economic development and ultimately political reconciliation. We can argue about whether that actually happened in a lasting way, but I guess my only point is that was a very formative experience for me. As a member of Congress and as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as a staffer, I was fortunate enough to travel, particularly throughout the Middle East, to see kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of development and diplomacy. Some areas where it worked, some areas where it didn't work, some areas where just sort of, we were dealing with the unintended consequences of neglecting basic economic deprivation for years, i.e. the incidents that kicked off the Arab Spring turned Arab Winter, and how that forced us to rethink some of our longstanding development programs. But I always go back to, I'm like an amateur Cold War historian, or maybe a better way to describe that is a failed academic who wrote a bad political science dissertation that's like decent history and bad political science. This used to be called mutual security in the Eisenhower administration. And I've always liked that idea that it's not charity, it's not just development for development's sake. It sort of expresses this connection between both us and our allies and development and security. And I don't know, but that explains kind of how I think about the overall issue in my own experiences.
You are preaching to this choir. I mean, that is exactly, obviously, how USGLC sees it. Can you actually elaborate maybe a little bit on that? Why is your committee and your mission important to the American people? Because you mentioned the American people,
Yeah.
and this is part of a comprehensive approach.
Well, not to be too much of a downer, but I think just look to Ukraine right now, where notwithstanding the obvious bravery and ingenuity that we're seeing from the Ukrainian people and how inspiring that has been for the West and what a wake-up call that's been. I mean, we're still seeing a war play out that even in the best case scenario going forward is going to be incredibly destructive in terms of blood and treasure. And I think if Ukraine reminds us of anything, it's that we should dedicate ourselves to the task of deterrence, to the task of preventing war. Deterrence may be hard, but war is hell. It's much harder. And for whatever reason, we tend to kind of periodically convince ourselves that we've kind of escaped this pernicious cycle of history whereby nation states can find themselves fighting each other on a battlefield. And I wish that were true, and I wish all of our disputes could be settled in non-kinetic means, but there's a lot of bad guys out there who don't play by the same rules we do. And so I think we need to have a clear-eyed view of that, and that should add urgency to the effort to work together to prevent war in terms of our development efforts, in terms of our diplomatic efforts, in terms of our military deterrence effort. And so translating that to the China Committee, one of my goals is to ensure that Ukraine's present doesn't become Taiwan's future. And when we talk about the defense of Taiwan or Taiwan's defense of itself, it's not just a matter of delivering foreign military sales items that they've purchased but we haven't delivered. It's not just a matter of having a bunch of anti-ship missiles there. It's a matter of expanding our cyber partnership with Taiwan, drawing on some of the lessons we've learned in Ukraine about that partnership and this defend forward concept in the military. It's a matter of thinking through the economic and financial aspects of a potential confrontation with China so that we can develop a theory of economic and financial deterrence in the same way that we have a theory of conventional and strategic deterrence. Because even in a low-end scenario for a confrontation with China, i.e. a blockade, you're talking about trillions of dollars lost and an absolute disruption to the global economy that's going to punish a lot of very poor people around the world. So I guess that's a long way of me saying I think part of our task on the committee is to learn the lessons from recent foreign policy crises and apply them in the Indo-Pacific so that we can preserve peace and stability. And I'll land on the point that I think, therefore, the American people should care about Taiwan, about the threat posed by the CCP, because it's not a distant over there problem. It's not a matter of some obscure territorial claim in the South or East China Sea. It's a matter of protecting our own economy and our own way of life and our own sovereignty from authoritarian and totalitarian aggression. And occasionally we have things like a spy balloon incident to remind us that it's not an over there problem, but then we lapse back into complacency. And so that's my pitch for why you should care about the work we're doing on the committee.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I mean, obviously.
Oh, did I lose you?
Obviously, we are the preeminent military, economic, political, diplomatic power in the world. And even if we want to ignore the bad guys, they're not going to ignore us. They're going to come after us. So thank you for that, Congressman. And I also thank you for making the linkage between what's happening in Ukraine and Taiwan. At the McCain Institute hosted our annual Sedona Forum. And at that forum, Taiwan's representative to the United States said, Ukraine's security is Taiwan's security. Ukraine's victory is Taiwan's victory. So clearly these autocrats are looking at one another, they're cooperating, coordinating, and we need to hold strong, exactly as you said, to preserve our economy and our way of life.
Could I make a point on McCain? Sorry
yes,
to upend
absolutely. No, you.
Well, before he passed away, I would say one of the most powerful experiences I've ever been a part of. I was doing well, first of all, he invited me when I was a member-elect. I wasn't even sworn in to the Halifax Forum. And he was so gracious to me and treated me like a member of Congress. It was a really cool experience. And then just made jokes about the Marine Corps for the entire
of course.
weekend. And then I was on a codel with Mac Thornberry where we were in Vietnam, and McCain happened to be there at the same time. And he gave us a tour of the Hanoi Hilton. And then obviously that was incredibly powerful. But to see the way in which he was basically treated like a rock star in Vietnam, and to step back and think about all the history we obviously have with Vietnam, and now they're such a positive view of America, and obviously they're a critical node in this alliance and partnership structure to counter China. I don't know. It was both a testament to McCain's unique leadership, but just the enduring power of American values, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. The McCain name means a lot. I know that Cindy McCain also spoke to this audience earlier today. She's also serving our country as we speak. Maybe the best way to end this, and I think that the time is up, is to ask you, just because you brought up Senator McCain, to just reflect quickly on the bipartisan element of your work, because you've received, rightly so, a lot of praise for your close partnership with your colleague, Representative Krishnamurti. If you could just talk a little bit about your approach there.
Well, I would confess I was really skeptical of working with Raja, not because he's a Democrat, but because he's from Chicago. And I have an ingrained distrust of Bears fans that's hard to overcome. But we've actually been good partners prior to this committee. We founded the Middle Class Jobs Caucus together, and he's been a phenomenal partner. And I think really has a very clear-eyed understanding of the ideological, economic, and military threat posed by the CCP. He's also just really, really smart. And so I really got lucky in terms of the partner I have on the committee. I would say both Speaker McCarthy and Leader Jeffries set the tone from the start. We had a meeting with all our committee members where both the Speaker and the Minority Leader were there, and this never happens. I've never seen it before. And they basically said, if you want to throw bombs on TV, we have committees for that. This is not that committee, and so kindly see yourself out the door. And they did a great job of selecting serious members on both sides. And so it's made it easier to preserve the bipartisanship. Obviously, there are fault lines, not just between the parties, but within the parties. Some of the biggest divides we have on this issue are actually not necessarily between Republicans and Democrats, but between, let's say, the national security community and the financial services community. So that creates a unique challenge at time. But I think we always have to remember, at least what I think, is that China's strategy, or the Chinese Communist Party strategy, is to divide us. It is what Wang Huning wrote when he published a book in 1991 called America Against America. That's not only sort of his particular thesis, it's the strategy that he and she have pursued in the years since, to pit Americans who they believe are greedy and factional against each other to prevent America from defending itself. So keeping that in mind is essential to preserving the bipartisanship, maintaining member relationships. The sort of platonic ideal in my mind is the relationship that I had with Angus King on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. We not only became partners on that commission where we trusted each other, we became genuine friends. And the more you have those personal relationships, the easier it is to get stuff done. And so that's sort of the ethos I've tried to take to the committee. Hopefully we'll be able to preserve that even as we get closer to the 2024 presidential election, which has a way of enhancing partisanship in Congress. But so far, it's been a great partnership. And again, I can't say enough good things about Raja for his leadership.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Congressman. We are lucky to have had you here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's hard for me to hear the thunderous applause, but I'm just imagining them.
We'll make it louder. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome USGLC Board Chair Sean Callahan.
Thank you all for joining here today for these important conversations. And as Representative Gallagher said, for really showing up for American leadership. My name is Sean Callahan. I'm President and CEO of Catholic Relief Services and a proud co-chair of the USGLC. And I'm honored to introduce today an important topic for us all to discuss, and that is the global migration crisis. We're seeing a record number of people throughout the world who are forcibly displaced from their homes at a time when humanitarian needs are at unprecedented levels, driven in part by frequent and lengthy conflicts as well as climate catastrophes. From Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to the drought in Africa, to the earthquake in Turkey, or the conflicts in the Middle East. There's no shortage of global challenges for us today, pushing people from their homes and changing how we deliver humanitarian assistance. Fortunately, it's not all negative. We have several incredible leaders in this space who are at the forefront of responding to these crises, and we're lucky to have them with us here today. Kelly Clements has served as the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees since 2015. In a role, Kelly is responsible for coordinating and implementing life-saving aid and protection in emergencies for displaced people throughout the world. She has 3 decades of experience working closely with refugees and on displacement issues, and we're lucky to have her here today. Sarah Charles is the Assistant to the Administrator of USAID, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance of USAID. The U.S. government's lead coordinator for international disaster assistance, and prior to her role here, she had roles with the International Rescue Committee as well as the National Security Council. And we're fortunate to have Ambassador Carl Hoffman to serve as the moderator, a career Foreign Service officer who has served as the Ambassador of Togo and who is now President and CEO of PSI, a global health organization working in over 50 countries worldwide. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Deputy High Commissioner Kelly Clements, Sarah Charles, and Ambassador Hoffman.
Hi, Sean. How are you?
Thank you very much, Sean. I have to say these events are among my favorite events in the calendar. It's a great occasion to reconnect with a lot of people who are coming from all over the country and joining us from hopefully all over the world, really, to talk about these hugely important issues. Great way to find old friends, make new friends, and USGLC is a great forum to do that in. Delighted to have the chance to talk to you 2 experts on this topic. We heard already about development defined in its broadest possible way. Now we're going to talk more about humanitarian issues. I think often we've heard that development is the business that's supposed to be working itself out of a job. I'm not sure that's really ever going to be true of the development conversation, but on the humanitarian side, we wish that were more the case. And yet the trends are going in exactly the opposite direction, right? Kelly, you, I think, are almost just off the plane from Bangladesh, for example, where you were visiting Cox's Bazar, a huge refugee population. UNHCR, your organization, has talked about 2023 as a year of reckoning, really, for this unprecedented number of people who are now in refugee status around the world. Double anything we ever faced before, I think, and moving upward. Talk to us about the scale of challenge and give us the perspective from just being in Bangladesh. What does that look like?
Thanks very much. And I'm really delighted to be here, and thanks to USGLC for the invitation. And obviously great to be on a panel with people I have admired for many, many years. We've said that forced displacement now is really the defining challenge of the 21st century. And as UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, we have enjoyed really bipartisan support from the US Congress. The American people, the US government has been strongly supportive of these efforts over many, many years. You know, we are, Carl, seeing now, we think with the data that should be out just later this month, about 117 million people that are forcibly displaced, people that are uprooted from their homes, refugees, internally displaced people. This is really something that is a huge challenge for the world. It's obviously a challenge for those individuals, and really there is a story behind every family that has moved. So it's very easy to get a little bit dizzied by the numbers. But we see now, of course, this is 1% of the world's population. And it is, war, conflict, persecution, and now we have the overlapping challenges of climate, poverty, development issues, and so on. And it really means that in places like the Sahel or the Ukraine war that rages on, or the Horn of Africa where we have millions of refugees, but now, of course, we have a drought and a climate emergency of astronomical proportion. And this means that we have the big challenges in terms of thinking differently about the way that we deliver. UNHCR, for example, is an organization where we're in about 137 countries. We have 20,000 team members around the world and 1,100 partners. These are entities that can get to places and be able to deliver protection and aid where others can't. And we rely heavily on partners, of course, but this is where we need the political expertise, the political weight, for example, of a government like the United States to come in and help us find solutions. And when we don't have political solutions, you have humanitarian actors like ours trying to save lives, but also make it possible for those people to be able to support themselves, to be able to find ways to have the tools and strength to be able to rebuild their lives. And I think now we see, and you're right, just off of a plane last night from Bangladesh, this is an area where we have the world's largest refugee camp, 1 million people in a camp called Kutupalong, very close to Cox's Bazar. It is one of the poorest parts of Bangladesh. This is also the largest stateless population in the world. And there are very few prospects now for these people to be able to go back to Myanmar. You see that there has been now a war raging with authorities now where you've got conflicts happening all over Myanmar. And that means, of course, refugees don't have the opportunity to go home, at least voluntarily, safety and in dignity. So we need to be there with partners to be able to deliver. We need to be able to be there to be able to provide, water, education, protection. And in cases like this, resources become fundamentally important. We're about $1 billion below where we were last year. And as an agency, of course, huge responsibility, increasing responsibility to be able to deliver in very difficult circumstances. Last year, we were responding to an emergency every 8 to 10 days. The normal was about that for the year previously. So these kinds of challenges are something that, of course, we are strained to be able to respond to, but we're really reliant on the kind of support, including what we receive from the U.S.
So your institution must be under huge stress. The whole system is under huge stress. Let me ask you this. You're an American. You occupy a senior role in a UN agency. We know from, for example, what Cindy McCain talked about earlier, the U.S. plays a huge role in the global humanitarian response, but not the only role. Talk a little bit about how the rest of the international community is engaged on these issues. This isn't just America helping on this.
Absolutely not. Well, the United States is the largest supporter. Of course, this isn't something that the U.S. alone can help to address. And for an agency like ours, we're about 96 to 97% voluntarily funded. We don't get assessed contributions from the world community, from the members of the United Nations. So it's all up on us to be able to raise the resources to be able to deliver protection and aid. We have strong support, of course, from many governments, some of the traditional governments, Europeans, for example, Australia, Canada, in addition to the US, but we're also expanding that reach. And we've seen over just the last few years, we've gone from somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 to 70 countries going up to 75 to 80 countries that are responding to our requirements, which is very helpful. And maybe to preview a little bit of a conversation later, we've also seen huge engagement from the private sector.
Good. Yeah, I want to come back to that. I
Yes.
do. Sarah, you, as the assistant to the administrator of USAID responsible for humanitarian assistance, you oversee, it must be the biggest chunk of what USAID spends every year. And in the last year, an inflated total, really, because of the global challenges that are underway. Talk to us about the scale of people requiring humanitarian assistance around the world. What does that look like now? What numbers are we thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, we really have seen an explosion in humanitarian need because of some of the compounding crises that Kelly talked about, coming on the heels just 10 years ago of the Mediterranean crisis that gathered so much attention. We had COVID. We've seen the impact of climate, as Kelly talked about, 6 failed rains in the Horn of Africa, record climate impacts there, catastrophic flooding in Pakistan, more than 40% of the country covered underwater last fall as a result of climate impacts. And then, of course, we've seen this really war of choice by Russia on Ukraine, which overnight created the world's biggest displacement crisis, almost overnight, really. In the first days of that war, millions of Ukrainians on the move to neighboring countries, but internal to Ukraine as well. And all at a time when the system was already dealing with chronic crises in places like Sudan, Somalia, Haiti, the Venezuela region, Central America, and elsewhere. So incredibly, incredibly strained. Kelly talked about the number of countries that UNHCR is in. Our Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance responded to more than 75 disasters last year in 65 countries, and increasingly responding not just in very fragile settings, but again, places like Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, that have these dual impacts of just a compounding debt crisis with overwhelming climate effects.
I saw a number, which I'm not sure is true, maybe you can validate it, that there's between 300 and 350 million people are expected to need humanitarian assistance this year.
Yes, and just to give you a point of comparison, if you had looked just 2 years ago, that number would have been south of 200 million, more like 175 million, which in itself was a tremendous number of people in need of humanitarian assistance. But again, just the impact of climate, of COVID, and in particular skyrocketing prices. We've seen not just expanding crisis, but the ability to for everyday people to meet their basic needs has become increasingly difficult, and particularly for those that are experiencing conflict.
So, I mean, 300 plus million people, that's the entire population of the United States. Yeah. We can think about that. If every person in this country were in a situation of humanitarian need, that's what the globe is facing, right? It's incredible. To deal with that sort of escalation of the need, and the resources aren't scaling at the same degree, right? Or as fast as they need to be, probably. There must be innovations in how you're doing this work, different ways of getting this work done. Talk to us a little bit about what you've had to innovate as how you deliver assistance.
Well, first, I'd like to say, while the gap between need and resources is growing, and I think we anticipate it's going to get worse next year, the U.S., and in particular the people in this room, the people that are watching, should be incredibly proud of how the U.S. has shown leadership over the last many years, but in particular over the last year. I think in many countries, when Russia's war in Ukraine started or expanded last year, they had to look to existing humanitarian budgets to respond not only to the rest of the world, but this new crisis of Russia's making in Ukraine. Whereas in the US, I think there was a widespread recognition in Congress, in part, I think, because of a lot of the work of of USGLC members to understand that this war was going to have devastating impacts globally. And the US showed real leadership by not just providing supplemental funding for the humanitarian response in Ukraine, supporting the Ukrainian people to be resilient in the face of this onslaught, but also ensuring that we were able to respond. The US government was able to respond to the tune of $17 billion last year between my colleagues at the State Department and at USAID, $17 billion in humanitarian assistance all around the world to the places that were going to be most impacted by the effects of Russia's war in Ukraine. First and foremost, it really allowed us to step up in a tremendous way in Somalia, northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, the places that were hardest hit by the compounding effects of record drought and skyrocketing prices because of what Russia was doing in Ukraine and the effect that had on commodity prices and supply chains around the world. And because of US leadership, I was up in New York 2 weeks ago for a Horn of Africa pledging event, and the refrain around the table was really thank you to the United States, because we heeded early warnings and responded robustly, and were able in Somalia to avert famine last year because of that early response. So I'd say one innovation that we've really had to call upon, even in an environment where we had resources last year, but certainly as we look forward, is really acting early and in fact acting in anticipation. That word is hard to get. Anticipation of events that are coming. Even many of you, I'm sure, are watching in horror with the impact of the attack on the dam in Ukraine,
Right.
the inundation that we're seeing affecting people who have already experienced the worst of this war in places like Kherson. In many ways, not to overstate this at all, because it's a horrific humanitarian crisis that's unfolding, but our partners were already there, pre-positioned supplies in anticipation of the unfolding offensive. Similarly, in the Horn of Africa, we'd invested over years in famine early warning that allowed us to act early, as well as investments, resilience investments, and things like working with herders on how to get information early about seasonal effects, cull herds. Don't wait for the whole herd to get sick. Manage smaller herds, and with the hope that will sustain through the worst of crises that are to come. I will say it's much easier to talk about and to sell response. The kind of big, visible search and rescue responses that we do after something like the earthquake in Turkey or Syria. It's much harder to explain and to gather support for the types of investment and adaptation and in resilience that really can save lives and save resources over time.
Tell me about it. I work in global health.
Yes.
The effort on prevention versus cure is exactly what you're talking about there. I want to thank you for mentioning how people around the table in New York expressed thanks, and I think we don't do that enough to all the taxpayers in the room and all the taxpayers watching. I know when I was a U.S. ambassador in Africa, I received the thanks directed to the American people many times, and I know you have as well, right? There is great recognition for the sacrifice that the American response to these global challenges represents. I was listening to something this morning about the UK, which used to be a very solid development partner as well. Something like a third of their former funding is now going to refugees. The US made a different choice in terms of the Ukraine to add in order to respond to it. Kelly, you mentioned sort of corporations and non-traditional partners in the work that UNHCR does. People might not assume that corporations have been involved with the refugee crisis around the world. Talk to us about public-private partnerships.
I will, Carl, but I just want to add on one little footnote to what Sarah has said, because of course it's life-saving what the support, including from the American people in the US, has done. But it also is in the national security interests. I mean, look at the stability that is created in parts of the world because of the kind of support that is coming, which is so important through partners like ourselves. On the private sector, outpouring of support, outpouring of generosity, particularly last year related to the Ukraine crisis, but not only. 20% of our budget last year was supported by the private sector. individuals, corporations, foundations, some of the innovations in terms of delivery, some of the cash support needed for families that were literally on the run, that needed some kind of basic support to be able to provide shelter and rent and clothing and that sort of thing. The private sector helped us basically put that into place within days, the kind of massive support. We were able to generate $1.5 billion related to the Ukraine crisis, in part because of the kind of innovation and support that the private sector provides. You know, there's an important role, obviously, resources, expertise, the engagement of the employees and the corporates and the like, but it's also about changing the narrative. And changing the narrative from one of refugees and internally displaced people as aid recipients to people that can actually use their skills, their own expertise, their own agency in order to support themselves. And this kind of narrative has been possible, including with corporate partners. We've got USA for UNHCR in the room, and they are really a mechanism in terms of the US businesses that are engaged with us all over the world. I was in Brazil 2 weeks ago, and there we saw Brazilian companies and those of the Americas that were investing in refugees' jobs, refugees, you know, in terms of the ability for Venezuelans, for example, to be put into school, into health services and the like. And it's that kind of inclusion, it's a win-win for business and for, of course, the displaced, forcibly displaced, because they can use their own resources then to support themselves as opposed to being dependent on others in order to be able to provide for their families.
So it's great to end on a high as you've just done there. Sarah, let me give you the final word. Give us a sense of hope. When you look at this hugely challenging environment around, what's the hopeful thing that you want to leave this audience with?
Yeah, well, I will say, you know, as much as we talk about compounding crises, there are places where I think we've seen U.S. leadership, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of that diplomatic muscle, help us turn the corner in terms of conflict. So last year, war was raging in Tigray in northern Ethiopia, in Amhara and Afar as well. And now we've seen really a resumption of normalcy and commercial life in Ethiopia that was in some ways unimaginable a year ago, in part because of U.S. government diplomatic support to the cessation of hostilities there. Likewise, in Yemen, I think we see some real openings. And I will say that U.S. leadership, again, has been really critical at a time when all eyes are on Ukraine and demonstrating that we're a global donor, we're a global force, that we are not just showing up in the places that are on the front page of the news, but also in the places like Haiti or Central America, or as well in places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka that are kind of off the news, but still of strategic importance to the U.S. government and to the American people.
Well, the work that your institutions are doing is hugely important in the face of huge challenges. So thank you for your leadership, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Okay.
And the globe.
The globe. All right, I'm bringing the whole world with me is right. So, my friends, okay, first give yourself a little stretch. I know it's a long morning, but this program, the content, I'm like furiously writing notes. I don't know about you, but hats off to the team. Everybody we invited wanted to come and be with you. It's smart, it's thoughtful, it's insightful, and our closer is going to wow you as well. I have to say, this is backed by popular demand because our closer for the morning session is one of the most prominent international journalists of our time, who goes to the harshest places on earth to report for all of us. But as I have learned, also has this hope and optimistic soul. Back on our stage for the second year in a row, because she was so fabulous last year, I'm thrilled to welcome Clarissa Ward, who, as you probably know, worked for Fox News, ABC, CBS, and today is CNN's multi-award winning chief international correspondent. Please welcome, we've had live from Beijing, Rome, Capitol Hill and on the stage at the Grand Hyatt, but now live from London. Welcome, Clarissa.
Hello. So good to be with you.
So good to be with us. You were so brilliant, as you always are. Last year, we wanted to have you in here and learn from you. And it is fabulous. And you're not going to be surprised, but I want to start. We've been talking a lot about Ukraine, and given what just happened literally in the last 24 hours, I'm going to talk to Ambassador Markarova, who we saw last night. I'm going to talk with her this afternoon, but I want to talk with you. You have literally, since day one, brought the war into our living rooms and our homes with the harshness and the optimism in the stories, and it's been profound. And I want to remind the audience what Clarissa does for us with a 30-second clip of what you did. Watch for a second.
Можно вам помочь? Можно вам помочь? Мне очень жарко, это плохая. Можно вам помочь? Давайте мне вот это, давайте мне. I'm just going to help her carry this bag a second. Excuse me, John, while we try to... ну вот, ничего страшного, ничего страшного. Как вас зовут?
Amazing. She's in the middle of reporting and she stops to help this woman get through this harsh. I mean, amazing. You're amazing. But that's not all, my friends, because this is the question I'm going to ask her. Clarissa goes back in February for 12 weeks of reporting, 20 weeks pregnant. Take a look at this picture. There she is. Congratulations. You just had your third son, which is why she's live in London and not here. So congratulations to you. So here's my question. Clarissa, what did you see in your reporting just in February? What's the resolve, the fear, the hope of the people you saw? What's happening there? Welcome.
So thank you so much for that gracious introduction. It's my pleasure to be with you again. I think what you see now in Ukraine is still that incredible resolve, still that determination. People understand they have come so far and they are not about to quit now. And with that, I think comes a lot of exuberance for the possibility that they might be able to deal a decisive blow to Russia once and for all. But at the same time, I think we have to be very clear about the enormity of the cost and the enormity of the sacrifice. And I spent a lot of time in areas of Ukraine that have been liberated, that have been taken back from Russian forces. And I have to tell you, victory is not pretty. Victory is towns and villages that have been smashed to pieces, where there are no basic amenities, where women told me stories of being raped, where men told me stories of losing their families, where elderly people are living on their own in the wreckage of bombed out buildings and trying to survive. So it's ugly and it's brutal, and the people of Ukraine are suffering enormously. And I think it's so important for us to never lose sight of that. But there's no question, they are in it to win it. They are determined, they are steadfast, they are strong, and they are some of the most innovative and creative and quick learners that I have ever witnessed fighting any war anywhere.
Extraordinary. So I have to ask you, when you say in it to win it, I have to ask you about the other side, Putin. You speak 7 languages. Russia is one of them. You lived in Moscow when you were reporting for ABC. Putin has lost 100,000 lives, as reported, 100,000 injured. What is his capacity to stay the long game? What's your reporting from that end?
He has no other choice. I think that privately, President Putin would certainly recognize that this was an error, this war, that he had probably been given falsely rosy information from his subordinates, and that ultimately he went in with a very optimistic idea of how things were going to play out. It clearly hasn't happened that way. That said, conceding defeat or conceding a mistake is not an option for him. This is now an existential battle. he only survives as long as that war keeps grinding on, or as long as he can somehow try to make out like he has created some form of victory. So this is the most challenging element of the Russian side of this. It's not their weaponry, it's not their expertise, it's not their manpower, because they have shown themselves to be very flawed on those levels. It's the fact that for Putin, it's win or continue or die. And so because it is such a stark question for him, I think he will do anything and everything in his power to keep this war going until he can find some way to fashion it into a win for his people.
And Clarissa, when you are walking the streets of Ukraine, they're sending their children to school, they're going to work. What's the flavor on the street? They're going to restaurants, and then the sirens go off and they go to the shelters. What does it feel like?
This is the thing that I think is really difficult to appreciate from outside, because obviously in the news, we're really focused on the brutality and the heartache and the destruction. But in Kiev today, you can't get a table at a restaurant on Saturday night if you don't have a reservation. And so this was a big part of why I made the decision to go to Ukraine while I was heavily pregnant. I wasn't on the front lines, but I understood that there was excellent medical care, that life did in pockets of the country continue pretty much as normal. I don't want to say normal in the sense that everyone in the audience will be thinking of normal, okay? There's still air raid sirens almost every day. There's still drone attacks on a regular basis. There's still people having to send their loved ones to the front lines. So there's nothing normal about it, but the Ukrainians are so stoic and so strong and so determined that it's almost become a point of pride, I think, that they refuse to have their way of life really degraded and so they will keep having art exhibitions, and the ballet will go on, and the opera will go on, and the restaurants will stay open. And that, I think, really speaks to this spirit and to this determination to win. Whether they can win or not, honestly, depends on a number of different factors. We're seeing the beginning of this counteroffensive. These will be decisive moments and months ahead in which we will get a better sense, I believe, of what the ultimate trajectory or outcome of this war will be.
How many times did you have an air raid and you have to go into shelter when you were there?
Honestly, when you've spent a lot of time, you stop going to the shelter at a certain point, because they have an incredible app that tells you what prompted the air raid. And so there are certain things which are serious enough that you'd probably consider taking shelter, and there are others that are more precautionary, and you get used to it, and it goes off at 3 a.m, and you're like, you know what, I really just need that extra 2 hours right now.
I can appreciate that at 20 weeks pregnant. All right, I'm going to switch gears. I want to get your take on this. You have reported from Iran in your past, and I want to get your take on the protests that we saw last fall that were led primarily by young women, and what your take on it, if it means anything for the future. And I'm interested, as a woman who has reported a lot from the Middle East and kind of advantage, disadvantage, how that played out.
So, for my part, being a woman in the Middle East, I think has actually been an advantage for me, or I have decided to view it that way, because traditionally, I think women are seen, especially in very conservative societies, as being less of a threat than my male Western colleagues might be perceived. The women of Iran are nothing short of extraordinary. And I think what blows my mind, and which I have seen time and time again, but really reinforced in Iran, is that women refuse to be victims. Women are warriors in their own right and their own way. And they are determined, and they are fighting back, and they are engaging in bold acts of daring. And they are essentially thumbing their nose at a regime of septuagenarian clerics who have spent decades now dictating how women should dress, how they should behave, what they should be able to do in society. And so while the protests have quieted down for now, there's no putting this genie back in the bottle. And I think a lot of people understand that when there finally is a leadership change in Iran, when the Ayatollah dies, that there will be a real chance at that moment of, a sort of revolution or an uprising to be more successful. This time, it was basically quashed with brute force. Don't forget the Iranians supported Bashar al-Assad in Syria. They've seen how this playbook works. It is remarkably effective. If you kill and murder and torture and maim people, eventually they will stop coming out. For now. But in the long run, I don't think you have seen the loss of the Iranian women yet, not by any stretch of the word. By any stretch, and I continue just to be humbled, honestly, by their courage.
I love your optimism. Let's stick with women, and I'm going to turn to Afghanistan. You've done a ton of reporting there. I think there's a lot of concern about the women and girls of Afghanistan. What's your take on what's happening there right now?
It is a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. And I know that people in the audience right now are probably thinking, oh my gosh, it's too much. There's too much in the world. Like, how do we have the bandwidth to be engaged and feel empathy and compassion and really try to get our head around all these terrible situations? But in Afghanistan, you have something that as an American, I have found particularly heartbreaking, which is that for 2 decades, women were told, you can dream. You can have big dreams. You can send your daughter to school. You can be a judge. You can be a politician. You can do what you want. Yes, it's still a conservative society, but you have basic fundamental rights and they are protected. And we will help you do whatever we can to achieve those. And then in the blink of an eye, and I'll never forget this woman coming up to me as I was on the streets in the days after the Taliban took over. And this woman said to me, she pulled me aside and she says, what do I tell my daughters? What do I tell my daughters? Because for years I told them that they could be whatever they wanted to be. Now, at the same time, in the face of this heartache, and obviously Afghanistan's not a monolith and it's a different situation in Kabul to, the situation that you might find in Taliban strongholds. And there are plenty of women who support the Taliban and don't think of these issues in the same way. But what I also found going back more recently, again, Afghan women are not victims. They're not sitting home and crying about it. They're setting up secret schools. They're setting up vocational centers where they can go and continue to study. They're applying for every single possible fellowship, scholarship, grant, whatever they can to further their studies overseas. Now, the sad thing is that those options are not available, clearly, to the majority of women, but they continue in their own right to fight. And I don't know where it will end, honestly. And more broadly, you have this backdrop of extreme poverty, of severe hunger, of instability in terms of the security of the country. So I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. It is grim.
I love your honesty, but you keep finding this hope of some optimism, as I said in your introduction. So I'm going to go to another trouble spot because that's where you report from. For decades, you've been reporting on refugees. You had your, landmark reporting at the Syrian war. Today, we have 100 million refugees, people displaced in the world, the largest historic in the world. I'd welcome how you see the refugee crisis of today, if it's different or if it's not from your earliest reporting that you've been doing for almost 2 decades.
It has spiraled to a place where I don't think any of us could have predicted. And it has become abundantly clear that when you have instability in the world, when you have a kind of power vacuum at the top, there are consequences. And that consequence is a mass migration of humanity. Whether it's because of war, whether it's because of climate change, whether it's because of intense poverty, the net result or the end result is the same. I think that what you see today that is a little disturbing is how politicized the debate and discussion around refugees has become and around displacement. It's taken on a very toxic tone, which is not only unhelpful, but also, I would just argue, doesn't really address what the core issues are and doesn't really help us to get our arms around this problem and think about how we act globally to counter this catastrophe, or at least to meet the moment. Because the other thing to keep in mind is this isn't going away. With climate change moving in the direction that it clearly is, there are parts of the Middle East that will be uninhabitable in 40 years' time. So this is only going to become more of a challenge. And I really hope that we can continue to focus on it in the news and continue also to try to take the politics out of it for a second and just talk about it in human terms, but also in strategic terms, just like you saw in your panel before.
Clarissa, just out of curiosity, how easy is it for you to get into some of these difficult places? I mean, just as a reporter, getting in and out from a security point of view, from a mobility point of view, is just the reporting more complicated today? Roads? I mean, I just keep thinking about how you're just moving around as a reporter.
It's complicated, definitely. I would also say it's riskier in many ways. At a certain point in the past, I would say post 9/11 era, reporters became fair game. And we have seen so many of my friends, my personal friends and colleagues who have been killed and kidnapped and targeted and tortured. And again, we see journalists more frequently as well, particularly local journalists coming under attack in their own countries, being threatened. So it's a difficult time to be a journalist, and it is challenging to be able to do this work. I would say that honestly, having the benefit of a huge institution like CNN, with all the knowledge and experience and wisdom that comes with those three letters, makes it possible to do this work. Otherwise, it is incredibly difficult and you are incredibly vulnerable.
So 2 quick last questions. What happens if America doesn't show up? We're here as advocates to talk about America global leadership. When America isn't out there and leading, do you see a difference?
You definitely see a difference. You see, this shouldn't come as a shock. The US has traditionally been the sort of leader of the free world, right? You can't just pull away from that role or take a step back from it and not have a domino effect. And I see it and feel it most keenly because I'm traveling around the world and talking to US allies or people or countries that have traditionally been US allies. They feel it. They feel like they're being left out, hanging in the breeze, and they don't have that assurance. I think that obviously we live in a multipolar world and people understand that. But the idea, and I also understand the idea that, when you're America, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You get too involved, people criticize you. You don't get involved, people criticize you. That's just life. That's just life. And ultimately, I can definitely tell you from firsthand experience that the leadership of the US in the world is really relied upon by many different actors, particularly in this moment of democracies versus autocracies, which is the kind of pivotal geopolitical dynamic of our time.
So, Clarissa, maybe you can end here. As I watch your reporting as often as I can, and I feel like you see the absolute worst of humanity and you see the best of humanity. And one of the reasons I watch you is because you bring out that best. Can you share, maybe in your recent trip, where that hope is? Because thank goodness you go and you report from these harshest places, but I'd love you to share with us where you find that soulful hope and optimism.
Yeah, I mean, you find it in these moments, and it's my frustration, Liz, sometimes that it's really hard get that into the news, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to be on the front page.
Unfortunately.
Like these small acts of kindness, these small acts of heroism, of generosity. You know, I spent the day or 2 days with a volunteer in Ukraine who left his family who were in Europe, went back into Ukraine, and day and night drives to the front lines to collect the bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers to take them back to their families, because he understands that even though it doesn't change the loss that these families are experiencing, having that closure is so important to them. And he's not getting paid anything to do it. He's not part of any formal organization. He is risking his own life every day. He is a volunteer, and he does it simply as an act of kindness and mercy to these families, because he understands the value of being able to say goodbye and burying your dead. It is just one example. I see so many times people, just a small gesture, offering someone some food, giving them a ride, putting their arm around someone, and you see there is beauty and compassion and a very real and vivid and vibrant current of humanity that weaves among us all and binds us together. And when I see that, that's what inspires me and gives me the courage and the hope to keep doing this job, even though I am so often confronted with the flip side of that, with the darkness and with the evil.
Well, thank you on behalf of all of us for bringing the light into your stories. Thank you, Clarissa Ward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, my friends, that was a very full morning, but I loved every bit of it, and I hope you did too. We loved having Clarissa end that morning. It is now time for our Lunch and Learn seminars, where you get to do some of the talking and learning. So here's the opportunity. On the screen are the 4 different options that you can pick your own journey. There are 4 wonderful sessions with wonderful speakers and experts. Grab a lunch on your way out, and for our online audience and for our audience here, join me back in the main ballroom at 1:20 for our afternoon session. See you then.
So cool.